Should be started. There it goes. All right, welcome to Puget Sound Beekeepers June meeting. We're a 501(c) charitable nonprofit. So, everyone's still getting used to virtual meetings, it seems like, but if you're not familiar, the controls for Teams are, when you mouse over any of the videos, they'll pop up at the bottom. You'll see a camera, a mic. So during the presentation, if you could just mute yourself so that you're not making background noise or we're not getting echoes, that's great. And if you don't want your camera available to everyone, you can just click on the camera button to turn that off as well. Feel free to type chat questions in, and then Tracy will take little breaks and ask for questions. And at those times, you can always unmute yourself and ask your question then as well. So with that introduction, I'll introduce Tracy.
Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. We're going to talk about a little bit about swarm management and about making sure that we have lots of honey. So I'll go ahead and start presenting. So as I think everybody knows, the blackberries are blooming. Hopefully they're blooming in your area too. And now it's about making sure that you maximize that opportunity. So what most folks didn't understand this year, I think, is that we have to stay ahead of two things. It's the storage of the nectar and in the brood chamber. And this is a picture that I took of the first swarm of the year. And so far that swarm's put up, I'm going to guess, about 60 pounds of honey. So you'll notice a tale of four cities there. The two colonies on the left-hand side are overwintered colonies that I had, and they're huge. This was a couple of years ago, and they have obviously lots of bees in there, lots of honey production going on. And notice that the bees are using upper entrances, and we'll talk about that after a little while. And then on the right-hand side, you'll probably wonder why that colony on the far right is so small. Yes, it happens to all of us. That year, that colony swarmed. About 8:30 in the morning, my daughter came downstairs and said, "Mom, why are there a whole bunch of bees by my window?" I'm like, "I don't know, it's cold outside." Well, it was because those bees were swarming up and over the top of our house and over to our neighbor's house. And they landed about 60 feet up in the tree. Not a happy day for Tracy. The colony there with two deeps and two mediums, if you have a first year colony, that's typically the size that you'll have during the honey flow, or at least right after the honey flow. You should get up to a couple boxes if you've, a couple supers that is, if you've done everything right during the year. Now notice too that I've got different color patterns on my boxes. The bees, both the foragers and the drones, will drift a lot. And if you want to try to minimize that, just make sure that you have different colors and mix and match your boxes, because the bees can identify patterns. So if you only have, let's say, one color box right now, you've got 2 or 3 beehives sitting right next to each other, you can put stickers on there, or you can put some masking tape to delineate the boxes. They can tell the difference, and it'll help, like I said, keep the bees from drifting back and forth. So right now, I know that the bee blogs are talking about all sorts of things on when you should manage your brood and do your inspections, but especially this year, because it's so darn swarmy, I really recommend that you're looking in your boxes once a week right now. And it's all about making sure that the queen has continuous room to lay more eggs in the brood chambers. So whether you're using medium boxes or deep boxes, it matters not. But what you can do to make sure that you continuously give her extra space is, if you have mediums, it's easy to just add another box. Now, queen will not cross a bunch of honey to make it up into another brood area. So if you have nectar frames all the way across in the lower super, you really need to add that upper brood box underneath the honey. You can also remove capped brood if you've got a weaker colony. You can even them out, take capped brood out with the adhering bees. So if you do take the adhering bees, just make sure that your queen's not on there. If you're unsure of where your queen is and you can't find her on the frame and you're nervous, go ahead and shake those bees off onto the frames and just take the capped brood itself over to the weaker colony and then replace it with an open frame. We'll talk a little bit about where to put that here in a little bit. Deeper boxes are a little more complicated because you're usually working with medium supers and then deep boxes for the brood chambers. So you can take capped honey out and freeze it, or if you have an extractor, you can extract it and put it back in. If you have extra capped brood, same thing, you can take that out and give it to a weaker colony. Some people do use 3 deep boxes. That is rare because they're super heavy and they're harder to manage. So most people only use 2 deep boxes, but that you always do have that option. And one of my first PSBA meetings, I went to, someone asked, hey, can you use deeps for honey supers? And I don't know who it was, someone in the audience says, sure, but you only do it once because they're so heavy. All right, so other things to consider in the brood area. Notice that green frame there, the third one from the top. That's a drone frame, and I use those all summer long to help remove mites. Notice on the bottom of the picture, there's a couple of strips of masking tape on there. The upper one has the date that I need to get that drone frame out of there, because drone frames work great to help reduce mites, and they're terrible mite bombs if you accidentally leave them in there too long and all of the drones hatch. So I've just marked the date that I need to remove that frame on the piece of masking tape. And then the long strip on the bottom, I have the date that I checked the hive last time. So I leave a big long strip, so I only have to put 1 piece of masking tape on during the honey flow. Make sure too that you put that drone frame in the top box, because it's a big pain if you put it in the bottom box and then you have to take the top box off to get it out. All right, so you see this frame on the right-hand side has a couple of swarm cups on the bottom, swarm cells. I call them cups because there's no eggs in there yet. It's a queen cell when it actually has an egg or a larva in there. So what are the reasons for that? Well, it seems like this year, it's just because the bees like lots of them. But usually it happens, it's a natural form of reproduction. Last year's queens tend to swarm. If there's not enough room in the brood box for the queen to lay, then they'll swarm. And if there's not enough honey storage space, they'll also swarm. Just a quick note, you notice that the green frame has 3 frames in. As you're removing capped honey, that's usually on the outside, and you just move a frame that has a little bit of honey out onto that outer spot and then put a new frame in. A couple of the folks on the blogs are recommending that you do something called checkerboarding to your brood chamber, and that's where you take an empty frame and you put it on every other frame. And I don't recommend that at all. Contrary to popular belief right now on the blogs, that actually helps induce swarming, because the brood chamber and the eggs and the larvae are all separated, and the queen gets confused and the bees just hate it. So if you're going to replace a frame or 2, that's fine, but only put 1 or tops 2 frames per box as you manage that space that's empty. And then it's also a really good idea just to tip the upper box up and look underneath. And you'll notice that on the bottom of these frames, there's no queen cells or no swarm cells going on. So really, it literally just takes you a couple seconds to tip the lid, so to speak, look underneath, make sure that there aren't any queen makings going on there. And if there is, then you've got to manage that. But if there's not, you just go ahead and put the box back down. And then on the bottom there, I did reverse one of my boxes this week. All the bees were up in the top, all the brood. There was, maybe about 5 frames covered in the bottom. And there was a little bit of activity storing honey down there. So it's an easy thing to do. Just take the boxes off the bottom board and just flip them around the other way. Put the top box on the bottom and the bottom on the top. And then the queen will move up and start laying and fill up that other box. All right, this is a controversial one. Should I feed 1-to-1 syrup with my supers on? The answer is for sure no, if you've already got drawn comb and you're planning to sell your honey. The next one, maybe yes. This is where you need to decide, because right now, if you have no drawn comb, then it takes an awful lot of energy to start storing that. And if you have no drawn comb in your super, where are they going to put all the honey? They're going to put it in the brood chamber and fill it up with honey, and then the queen isn't going to have anywhere to lay. So if you feed them while they're starting to draw the comb out in your super, then you'll actually help prevent swarming. They're going to use all that sugar, water, energy to build the comb with anyway, so you're not going to be eating CNH honey. And even if there was a little bit of that left at the end of the season, it's not the end of the world. It tastes pretty good, actually, so long as you're not selling it, because obviously people don't want to buy CNH honey. They want to buy nectar honey. And so once your frames get drawn and they no longer need the energy to build comb, then stop feeding them. Oftentimes right now during the flow, they won't take it anyway. But think about it if your supers don't have any wax at all. All right, and then people always ask about queen excluders. Should I use them or should I not? And again, that's all a decision that you make. If you do decide to use a queen excluder, sorry, I really recommend that you use the one on the left-hand side. Notice that the grooves run parallel with the frames, and it's easy for the bees to get in and out of there. The one on the right-hand side is cheap, but the grooves go the other way, and it's really hard for the bees to get through there, and there's not very many gaps. And they tend to fill that up with propolis anyway. So that's definitely a honey excluder. They're cheaper, but it's not a good idea. And then this has an emery shim on the top, on the left-hand side again. Notice that the bees have an upper entrance there, and then sometimes they draw wax in there, but it's usually not very much. So I recommend using upper entrances right now because that nectar is really wet and it takes a lot of room. So you'll speed up actually the nectar collection, because if you think about it, if your bees have to go in the bottom entrance and all the way through the crowded brood chamber, that takes time and it's crowded, and it's like trying to go through Penn Station when it's super busy. It takes a lot of time for the bees and it slows them down. So if they can have upper entrances to use, then they can make more trips during the day. Then you notice that I've got emery shims on every second box. That way the bees can go in the upper boxes too. And then it also helps the airflow, which you want lots of warm air blowing through there to dry the honey out, because it needs to get down to about 17 or 18% water in order for them to start capping that off. And then the notched inner cover goes right underneath the lid. So the colonies there that you see have actually 1, 2, 3 upper entrances they can use right now. All right, and then the honey storage area, like I mentioned earlier, the nectar takes a lot of room to store. So this is where you can err on the side of too much space as opposed to too little space, because they actually need that extra space to spread out and store that nectar while it's drying, and then they'll move it to the frames that they're about ready to cap. Notice that I've checkerboarded this one. Checkerboarding here is an efficient way to slow down the swarming urge, because bees like to have their houses in order when they swarm. And it's definitely not in order. As you can see here, yesterday I put 5 brand new honey super frames in here for illustration purposes and divided everything up. Now, if you're going to use multiple boxes, think about it in a 3-dimensional way, so that you have, on this one, you have a used frame and then a new, and then a used and a new. And the box above that, start with a new, used, so it's opposite of this box. And as I mentioned earlier, don't do this in your brood boxes. You'll really be sorry. All right, and then another thing that seems to be happening a lot is bearding. Kit sent me this picture a while ago, and I put a post on my Seattle honeybees site talking about bearding. Why do they do it? It's just because there's too many hot bodies in there over the brood. And so they have to have about a 93-degree temperature right in the brood. If you think about it, all those extra bees hanging out in there makes the brood actually too hot. So the foragers tend to move out of the way. So they'll move up into the honey supers and they'll move out onto the front porch. So you can use upper entrances to help with the airflow, add extra space for the bees to just spread out in on the inside. You can use a screened bottom board that helps with the ventilation. You can use something called a slatted rack, which is the picture there. It goes right above your bottom board, and that just gives the bees extra space to hang out. The other reason why they beard is they're getting ready to swarm. So this year, if you've got bees that are bearding, with the swarm urge being so strong, I really recommend that you take a look at that right away. It's probably just managing the humidity and temperature, but it might be that they're getting ready to swarm. All right, and at the beginning of the meeting, due to popular request, I added this slide. So this year has been a really weird year for food, and it's counterintuitive that during a honey flow, your bees might be starving. So my bees are starving because they don't have enough pollen. Well, they're not starving because I've actually gone through 10 gallons of pollen patties. I make it by the 5-gallon bucket. 10 gallons of pollen patties I've used this year. I've never used that many before because it's rained so much. And because I used pollen patties early, they've got a lot of brood to rear. And people know that they need to feed their new bees syrup, but they don't learn that they need pollen patties. So the older bees, the foragers, they use nectar and honey for their energy. The new bees, the young bees, need protein, and they also use the protein to make the brood food. So all that glistening white brood food around those larvae takes pollen and it takes protein. So this is from Randy Oliver's scientific beekeeping site. And so on the top left-hand side, you see the nice honey arch on the top with that interface of pollen and then the brood. So if you're looking in your colony and they don't have any honey arches, they need syrup, even if the blackberries are blooming. And then if on the right-hand side on the top there, you notice that that interface is empty, then the bees are going to stop rearing brood. The queen either stops laying eggs, or they eat them as fast as she lays them in order to have protein to feed themselves and to feed the other larvae. So they cannibalize the colony and really slow down the growth. So Randy's got a great beginner beekeeping section on his website. I highly recommend it. And he talks quite a bit about this concept of making sure every time you look in your colony that you've got the right food resources. All right, and so just in summary, remember to stay ahead of the nectar storage space and the brood nest space. It's because we've fallen behind in one of these things or both that the bees are all swarming right now. And then just a sneak peek for July, with everything being slow. July is when the yellow jackets start coming out and being a real problem. So order your robbing screens now. Make them. Most of the site or most of the beekeeping places are taking a week to sometimes 3 to get stuff, depending on what it is. And so this is a picture of 2 of my colonies that I have in an outyard. And the colony in the forefront, all of those bees are not actually honeybees. Those are yellow jackets that have killed that colony. Even though I did have a robbing screen on there, the remaining honeybees absconded to the hive next to them and all crowded in and said, "Let us in." So this is a real problem, and it's a real heartbreaker when you've worked so hard to build up a colony and the yellow jackets take it away from you in an hour or 2 or a day or 2. So if you haven't got those already, make sure you order them. With that, that's the end of the presentation, and we can do questions. I didn't have the.
There's a question in chat from Christian. What else can we do about yellow jackets if she already has tons in her yard?
Find the nest. Yeah, all you can really do is make sure you have a booming colony, make sure that they can defend their entrance. So right now, you notice that on my colonies, I've got the entrance reducers off. I would put, as soon as I see yellow jackets, what I do is I put the robbing screens on, and my bees don't use the bottom entrance very much anyway, but by putting the robbing screen on, it really helps protect your colony. And then you've just got your upper entrances that 5 or 6 or 10 or 12 bees can protect from the yellow jackets. And I've seen the yellow jackets come in and they'll all clump together and they'll actually move with the yellow jacket in unison to keep them out.
So last year I had yellow jackets kill both of my hives, and I had robbing screens on both of the hives. Would you recommend not using an upper entrance? If you have it, take it off?
So let me go back to this, hold on. On the robbing screen, did you have the front entrance open or closed?
Oh God, I don't even remember. I don't remember. It was last year.
So chances are you had this front entrance open.
Uh-huh.
And then, so what you need to do as soon as you see yellow jackets coming in is close the front entrance, and some will have 2 and some will have 1. So close both of the front entrances and only leave the one up in the top open. Because the yellow jackets are dumb. They don't know how to land on the box and then go down inside. They just fly forward. So that's why you've got to have those front entrances closed.
So do they use the entrance reducers? Or sorry, like the second hole, the second entrance up at the top of the hive?
Yeah, the honeybees will use this entrance.
No, I'm talking about the yellow jackets. Will they use?
They usually won't figure that out.
Okay.
That's probably what happened.
Well, no, I'm not talking about this. So I had this, but I'm wanting to put the second entrance above the brood chamber, before the honey,
Yep.
The upper entrance. Do I need to worry about yellow jackets with the upper entrance?
If you have a big booming colony.
It's brand new right now.
So only have enough entrances that they can protect.
Okay.
So you should always have a upper entrance in your
by the roof.
Inner cover.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's probably enough for right now if your colony is small.
Okay.
I mean, it looked like someone had their hand raised. Sydney?
Yes, hi.
You had a question?
I do. And thank you for letting me join as a guest. So when you put the inner cover on top of the honey super and the top cover is on top, my question is, for the inner cover, do you have the entrance hole facing up or facing down?
Down like this.
Okay.
Yeah, because that way the bees can go right into the frames. If it's facing up, they have to go in and then all the way across and through that hole and then down inside.
Correct. Okay, good.
Facing down so that they have direct access to the frame.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, good question.
Can you place a beehive under a tree? Big tree, no sky can be seen under it.
Yes, bees live in trees all the time.
Yeah, and that's from Adam. And for reference, most of my hives are under big trees, under maples and stuff that get a little, maybe half an hour of morning sun and then no direct light the rest of the day.
Yeah, now my bees that are in the sun, in the morning get up earlier and work more hours than the ones that are under trees. So if you have an option to put it in the sun, that'd be better. But if all you have is under trees, then you're fine.
And Jennifer asked if she can talk to me about the top bar class. Maybe after the Q&A period, we can stay on. Jessica asks, is a rubbing screen preferable to an entrance reducer? How does it differ?
Yeah, so the entrance reducer is not preferable. So you want a robbing screen because you can close off the front entrance. Because the yellow jackets only fly forward. So the robbing screen, it has a gate on it, so you can close that front entrance. And then the honeybees will go up and use that top entrance. So they'll land on the box and then go down into the colony. And the yellow jackets usually won't figure that out. So that's why you want a robbing screen instead of the entrance.
Can you repeat what you were telling us about probably why bees are swarming?
Yeah, so it all has to do, hold on, I'll present my screen again. Or not. All right, can you guys see that now?
Yeah.
So it all has to do with one of two things. They don't have enough space in the brood chamber, or they don't have enough space in the supers where the honey goes. Or the third answer is they just want to, and there's not anything we can do to stop it. Because I went and helped a lady with her bees that swarmed, and I have no idea why they swarmed. They had plenty of room. They had food. It was this year's queen. It made no sense.
The one thing I've seen, Tracy, this year is there's the crowding swarming that happens, and then I've seen more of the reproduction swarm impulse going on this year, where they're not really crowded, but they're just doing it anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Jesslyn, maybe to your thought tree here is when you're inspecting, are you inspecting weekly?
No, I kind of cut back.
So you're missing the signs probably, because if you are inspecting every 7 to 10 days, you'll see those cells before they get capped or right after they've been capped. And then you could take the queen and put her in a nuke and prevent the swarm from happening.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
That's more work, but yes, that's how you prevent it. I always see beekeepers spending so much work trying to capture their swarms. I'm like, you could have just inspected your hive and an extra couple hours a month, and you wouldn't have had all the headache and stress of trying to pull a swarm out of a tree that's 30 feet up.
That is fun, but it's not recommended.
Yeah, well, don't kill yourself trying to catch that swarm.
Right.
Looks like we've got another hand that's up. Lisa?
Hi, this is my first meeting, and I'm really enjoying this. I've been a beekeeper for about probably 7 years now, and this year's been a little different. I had one hive winter over, so it's strong. At this point, I've got 2 deeps and 1 super on. The super, I checked it today in my inspection, and it's about 60% full of capped honey. Now, my other hive, which was new, I noticed that the queen was laying drones. So I had to requeen. I had to go get a new queen and requeen. I looked at that today, and it just is a very weak hive. Not a lot of brood, sporadic. It's surviving, and so but not strong. And my question is, should I move the weak hive and put it in with the stronger hive and just kind of work with one hive for the rest of the year?
That's a good question. And you don't have to do that if you want to go into winter with 2. You got a couple of choices. You can add, remember I said earlier how if that's got too much brood, you can take a frame of capped brood out and move it over into the weaker colony.
Oh,
I
right.
do that because my bees are carniolan mixes, and sometimes they outlay the 2 deeps that I have. So I'm constantly taking frames out and putting them in weaker colonies. So you could definitely do that.
Okay.
You could, combining them is an option. You could also, the third thing you could consider is leaving them like they are until the blackberries are done blooming. So that's right now is your maximum honey opportunity with that booming colony.
Mm-hmm.
And you could leave them until after the blackberries are done blooming, and then take a couple of frames of capped brood and put it in with the other queen.
Okay. Okay. In either case, moving a brood from the stronger hive into the weaker hive.
Right. The
Okay.
other thing that we didn't mention is, why is that colony weak besides the fact that they had queen problems? It's possible that they have a really high mite count right now, and that's why the brood is sporadic. So I would definitely make sure and do either an alcohol wash or a sugar shake,
Okay.
and see what your mite counts are. And if they're below or if they're above 2%, then you definitely need to treat.
Oh, okay. That is a good point. I didn't look for that. Okay, I will do that. Because yeah, it's odd that it's the same hive again. Same issue with the new queen. Okay.
Yeah. And some queens, their genetics aren't as good as others at keeping the mite counts low. If you're not using drone frames, it's getting kind of late in the season to start using them, but they really do work, and it's a cheap, easy way to help reduce the mites.
Yeah, I wrote that down for next year then, or actually I'm thinking about doing it this year, but I'm not going to do it since it's late. I'll do that for next year. So thank you. All right.
Yeah, buy 2 per colony so you can have one, and then when you take it out to put it in the freezer, you can put the other one right in.
Okay. Okay. Thanks so much. Appreciate
You're
it.
welcome. Kathy's itching to say something.
Yeah, Kathy's got her hand raised here.
I just wanted to say that sort of an easy fix for that would be to swap positions of the hive so that the strong hive foragers would go into the weaker hive, and that usually will spur the queen on when there's a lot more resources coming in. She'll lay more eggs. That oftentimes gives a real quick boost, and you're not having to swap frames or anything. It's just swapping positions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'd
wait till after the honey's done.
I always go with the hard method, where I would decide I didn't like that queen, so I'd get rid of her, make them queenless, and then move my queen from the colony I liked over, let her start leading that colony, and let the strong colony raise a new queen. And then I have
Would I
genetics
do that
like.
after the blackberry flow? Would all this occur after blackberry flow?
Oh, if I was going to do that, I would do it now, so that because then your queen now there's no one laying eggs in there, so then they're going to all that energy is going to be directed to bringing in nectar and raising a new queen. So you actually would even probably get more honey from that hive than you would any other way.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
That's a little bit more complex though, because you got to make the hive queenless, go back a few days later.
Doing that, and I'm thinking, you know what? I might just go with the brood method first, see what happens, and check the mites. Do a mite count. Thank you.
Yep, there's a bunch of options. So
yeah, Magnoli's got her hand up, and you're muted.
Hi. Yeah, I had a quick question actually about using brood frame to control mites. I took your advice and I started doing that, but I never quite know when to remove them, because there's this ideal that it's when they're capped, is my understanding, but there was a little bit capped, and then the rest they were either at egg stage or starting to be raised. I don't know if I pulled it too early. I have the other one in because it's my first year, so they're building the frames anyways. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you want to take those out when they're capped, because the mite jumps in the cell right before it's capped.
Mm-hmm.
And so the more that you have capped on there, the more mites you're going to capture. Now, it takes 24 days for a drone to go from egg to hatch. So I put 24 days on mine. Unless it's not drawn yet, then it's going to take an extra, variable amount of time. So I look at 24 days, and then when I pull it out, if it's still mostly uncapped, then I'll put it back in for another week. And that way, some of them will hatch. Your colonies need drones anyway. So if some hatch, that's fine. But so long as you catch most of it capped, that's the ideal time to take it out.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, good question.
There's a bunch of questions in chat. Did we answer? Jennifer Short says, with the super of new foundation, would you super up or under with the new foundation box?
So does your one have honey in it already?
Jennifer, can you unmute yourself?
I'll just go for it. So there's no difference. I read a couple articles about which way to super, and there was no statistical difference in how much honey you got, whether you put this new super on the top or the new super on the bottom. What I've personally found is that if you have drawn comb and you want to add a second super, is to go ahead and checkerboard it at that time and put the drawn comb on the outside, because they'll draw comb better on the inside frames, and then just checkerboard it, and then they'll draw those new frames out in between. And it also helps keep them from swarming in case they're thinking about that.
All right, the next question with Lenina. Should I close the lower entrances on robbing screens as soon as I see yellow jackets?
Yes.
Okay. Bill says, can you say a little bit more about how to determine whether or not you have sufficient brood space? For example, if brood is in 5 of 10, for example, if brood is in 5 of 10 medium deep frames in my top medium super with pollen and honey outside, is that too little brood space?
I'm not tracking. I'm trying to find it.
Sounds like a train going at 30 miles an hour. Okay, so if the brood is in, maybe I think they're getting lost in the fact that it's not a number of frames that are open. It's maybe describe what the brood nest should look like and what you're looking for to determine if they're running out, if the queen is running out of laying space.
Okay, so right now you probably have on the outsides, you have honey or nectar. And then you probably have another one that has the next one in, you probably have nectar on the outsides, and then it should have pollen on the insides. And then that leaves you, if you're running a 10 frame box, that leaves you 6 frames in the middle. So if all of those are full of brood, then there's no room, right? So you should have at least 1 or 2 frames in each of the boxes that are open for the queen to lay on. So what I do is each week I go out and I make sure that there are 2 open frames in each box, or in the top box. If you're running mediums, you want to make sure there's 4 frames. You want 2 open frames in the top one and 2 open frames in the middle one, so that they can draw wax and so that the queen can come back and lay. So oftentimes what I'm doing is I'm taking out 2 frames from each top box and moving them somewhere else, either to a weaker colony, or I'm extracting honey, and I'm always leaving two open frames. Now that can include your drone frame too.
Thanks, Tracy.
Uh-huh.
Let's see, the next question, Andrew. Tracy, what do you do with the excess of the bees after flow is over and you pull supers off the hive? Do you feed? Do you split?
So normally you wouldn't split. And so the solstice has come and gone. And so now the bees, your population is at its highest or close to its highest. And so the queens will start laying less eggs now throughout the rest of the summer. So the population in your colony will continue to start declining at this point. Now, Randy Oliver talks about how that's really critical in late July and August because your bees are declining, but what are your mites doing? They're going up. So there's a critical time point where you end up with a way bigger percentage of mites than you should have. So what do I do after the blackberry flow is over? I personally spin out all of my blackberry honey because I have my own extractor. And then I'll put, depending on how big the colony is, I'll always put the box back on and have them lick out all of the wax so that I store my supers dry. If I store my supers wet, they get ants in them and they get moldy and icky. So I always put them back on the colony and let them lick that out. And then as the colony size starts declining, I'll take one box off at a time with the empties. So if I have 2 boxes on, say, and I've got 7 frames with a little bit of honey, then what I'll do is I'll make sure and consolidate all those into one box and take that other box off and store it. So as they decline, then just start reducing the box sizes back down and taking off those upper entrances, because as the bee population declines, then it makes it easier for the yellow jackets to get in. And I saw one of the other chats is kind of related. One of the questions is there a second flow? And kind of, yes, but blackberry is definitely our major flow. If you live in an area that has knotweed, there is a second flow in September, late August, early September, that's knotweed. And then if you live by fireweed, that usually is blooming later, although Kathy's was blooming already at her house in Woodville. And then late in the season, there's an ivy flow, and you don't want that. So I always feed my colonies in the fall to keep them from gathering so much ivy honey, because the ivy honey crystallizes really fast and they can't eat it in the winter. So they'll fill their frames up with white, stinky ivy honey that they can't eat. And you could freeze that and save it for the spring. They can eat it in the spring because they can go out and get water, but they'll starve on ivy honey in the fall and winter.
You missed the fall flow where your bees are robbing out your neighbors' hives that have died from mites. They bring in a lot of honey that time of year.
Yes, they do.
Okay, so Tylee has a question that tags onto this and also raised their hand. Does the blackberry flow, when does it typically end in Seattle?
When the last white flowers are on. So that's a smarty pants answer, but the blackberry flow is so variable in this little area. So my blackberry started blooming 2 weeks ago. Kathy's just started blooming. I've got bees up in the Renton Highlands. They just started blooming this week. So whenever they start blooming in your area, they usually bloom for about a month. I know that's kind of a hinky answer, but it's really variable on where you are and the weather.
Yeah, we have a lot of microclimates. Even in the city, every neighborhood varies. So you've got hills where the top of the hill is going to bloom 2 weeks ahead of the sides where it's cooler.
Yeah.
Did you have another question, Tylee, since your hand's raised?
Yeah, it kind of goes with the brood space management. So Tracy, this is my first year, and I'm not expecting to take any deep frames out of my hive, right? So like even if they run out of space, I already added a medium with all empty frames, but they're drawing out wax on those frames. So it's unlikely that I would have to create more space in the brood chamber, right?
Not necessarily. So because you only have one super that you just put on and there isn't frames, or there isn't a wax on there right now, they're bringing back a lot of nectar and they've got to store that somewhere. So what they do is they store it in the frames in your brood chambers. And then you end up with something that's called being honey bound. And so you've got so much honey in there, there's no room for the queen to lay eggs, so they'll swarm. So if you don't want to take honey from them, that's no problem, but you do need to get those honey frames out of there temporarily. And
Okay.
so what you can do is just make sure they're capped first, and then take them out, freeze them for a day or two to kill the wax moths, and then store them somewhere cool in your house. And then this fall you can put them back in.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I just noticed there's another comment here about fireweed blooming at Northeast 75th and 15th. I think the comment here is in the lowlands, fireweed blooms early summer. When you go up in the mountains, you're going back in time really, because their season starts much later. So when you go up in one elevation, their fireweed and all your spring flowers here are just starting up there. So I think that's probably the difference there is you can chase the elevation if you want to keep following a certain nectar source.
Yeah.
Let's see, the next question here was, wait, that one. I skipped Kit's question. Pollen arch. What if they have nothing in an arch but have honey and pollen on the end frames of every box?
That's okay.
Yeah. Sometimes that arch is bigger than a single box. You think of all your boxes like a big circle. So you're just looking at the walls of the circle, not the top.
Yeah, I have a huge colony right now. That picture of that swarm at the beginning, that is the weirdest colony. They don't collect pollen. So I have 2 deep boxes, and they've drawn all their own wax this year. So they drew 2 deep boxes and 3 supers, and there is not a drop of pollen anywhere in there. So I've taken to taking a big glob of pollen patties and sticking it on top of the queen excluder. And they eat probably 2 pounds of pollen patty every couple weeks.
Brian asks, if you move a queen to a new hive like you just described, Jeff, do you need to cage her for a few days? If I make the hive queenless for at least 5 or 6 days, so that they're wanting a queen, and then I would move her in with several frames of brood, and from her own hive with her own workers, and they're just going to accept her without any problem for the most part, especially if she's coming with brood. If I didn't have any brood, I just wanted to move the queen, I'd probably put her in a cage with a candy plug, just to be safe.
And lots of smoke doesn't hurt either.
Thank you.
But yeah, I just make sure they're queenless for several days, and then they'll accept her. And the same is true if I'm putting a queen cell in there. I'll want them to be queenless for at least 24 hours, so they don't tear down that cell right away. Bill asks, are there arguments for and against leaving full honey sippers on or taking them off as they fill up? Pulling heavy sippers from up high is a little tough on the back. Also, will wax moth be a risk for stored honey sippers?
So yes, you've made a very good and compelling argument for taking 1 frame off at a time. And that's exactly what Kathy does, because those honey supers do get super heavy, especially if you take, if you only run 9 frames in your 10 frame box, they will fill in extra honey and it gets even heavier. So a full honey super, a 10 frame box, a medium box is on average 40 pounds of honey. So you're more than welcome to pull those off. And yes, wax moths can be a problem. So it's really best to freeze the frames for a couple of days when you take them out. And then wax moths are more of a problem in honey supers that have had eggs and larvae produced in them, because they love to eat that dark comb. And that's what they're after. So if you never let your queen lay in your honey supers and you store them dry, then the chances of wax moths is lower. I mentioned lower because I had 4 beautiful frames or 4 beautiful boxes stored at my cabin this summer or over the winter, and I was greeted when I took them off a couple weeks ago to wax moth infestation like I've never seen before, and I was pissed because they ruined all 4 boxes. So they're always a problem, and just try to mitigate it as best you can.
If you have a lot of space, you could you can hang your frames so they get light on them.
Kathy uses those moisture boards, the ones you buy, and she'll take a box of honey and put it on the floor so wax moths can't get in, and then she'll put a moisture board on top of it and a weight on top of that so that it helps keep the moths out while she's waiting to extract.
All right, Bill asked, could you say a little bit more about smoke when introducing queen?
So
I don't actually use smoke. Yeah, I think the smoke would be to smoke the workers, not the queen.
Yeah.
And so if I was introducing a queen to a new hive, I would probably smoke the workers in the queenless hive and then introduce the unsmoked frames with the queen on it so that they have the pheromone and they could start sharing it with the bees that were sort of doused. But I usually don't use smoke at all. What do you do, Tracy?
I think that's a good idea. And I light my smoker and I let the smoker run all the time while I'm out in the yard. I don't necessarily use it on all of my colonies, but I just let it smoke.
Yeah, I'm not talking about not using smoke. When I'm doing anything with a queen, I don't want to mask her pheromone. Usually. Maybe I might sugar spray some of those bees too. I don't know. My mite count last week was 2.5 a cup, but I saw a mite riding on a drone walking around. Should I treat for mites now or wait to reach up?
What?
2.5 a cup. That's a lot. Wait, half a cup of bees should be 300,
half a cup of
right?
bees
So
is
two mites
300
per 200.
bees.
That's good.
That's good. So if you did a alcohol wash and you only had 2 mites in that half cup, you're good.
Yeah. So I guess the question I would have, Christina, is was that powdered sugar or was it alcohol?
Alcohol.
Yeah,
you're good.
That seems good.
Yeah, that's really good.
Even though I saw it cruising around and on that drone, I was like, I thought if you could see them with your eye, that you're supposed to.
No, it was a lucky catch. So for those of you that don't know, you should use a frame of nurse bees to do an alcohol wash. So find a frame that they're starting to cap, because remember I said on the drone frames that the mite jumps in right before it's capped. So those mites are on the worker bees. So the nurse bees. So you'll have the highest concentration there and on the drones. So dump the nurse bees in a bucket and then scoop your half cup from there. Just make sure you don't have your queen, and then put them in the alcohol. But 2 is an excellent count, Tina.
Okay.
So Kathy's got her hand raised. Kathy?
Oh God. Yeah, now I forgot what I was going to say. Typical.
Was it about introducing queens, Holland arches?
Oh, smoking. No, it was about smoking. I do the same thing. I light the smoker. The only time I really use it is like to smoke the bees away from the edges of a box when I'm going to put another box on top, so I keep from squishing them. And then if I get stung, then I smoke myself, because the bees put a pheromone with that sting on you that the other bees don't have to know anything. They just follow the smell and they go sting the same place. So I mask it with smoke.
Yeah, and it looks like Ken has his hand raised as well.
Yeah, when it comes to storing supers and wax moth issues, I have in the past lost a lot of comb to that. But the way I finally solved the problem, and I haven't had a problem with it since, is I store them outside so that when the temperatures get cold in the wintertime, they get cold too. And the temperature drops. If I store them inside, they get more wax moth problems because they can incubate better. And so what I do anyways, I stack them outside on a concrete block with 4x4, and then I put down a queen excluder, and I use wedding veil material, which is a synthetic, and cut it to fit. And then I store my boxes there, and I put in every box, I put a layer of wedding veil material. And so if they do get in, they can't travel freely from one box they can't travel through the whole stack.
Yeah, that's good.
That's a good idea.
It's a synthetic fabric, so they can't produce an enzyme to cut through it like they could cotton or anything like that. And
they eat right through plastic bags too.
Say what?
They eat right through garbage bags too.
Yeah, but wedding veil, they just don't want to get married, I guess.
That's awesome.
All right, it looks like Gardner Young, or sorry, Benjamin has a question here. Newbie started with a nuke and have 2 deep brood boxes that are 70% full, 9 frames capped brood, 5 frames honey in various stages of completeness, 2 frame feeder, and 4 frames foundation. Does it make sense to add a medium super this year?
Yes.
Should I use a queen excluder below the super?
So yes, you're ready for a super. As far as the queen excluder goes, I use them. A lot of people don't. It's just really your preference. If you do use a queen excluder, I think it's important to use upper entrances.
All right, and then Adam has a trick question for you here. Does the swarm leave with the old queen or a new queen?
Well, that depends. So
Is it the first swarm or the second swarm?
Or the third swarm. So the first swarm of the year, called the primary swarm, leaves with the old queen, leaves with that. And then the bees make more queens. And so I think what's been happening this year is that the secondary swarms are really getting people because they're not looking in their boxes and not recognizing what's going on, and they end up having multiple queens hatch. So there's multiple virgin queens, and so that's when you start casting after swarms. And so sometimes the swarm will leave with a virgin queen. Sometimes the virgin queen will go out to mate, and the bees will be confused, and they'll go with her, and then they'll come back. So if you have a swarm leave and come back, that's usually what's happened. So every once in a while, you'll pick up a swarm and it'll have multiple virgin queens in it. So Kit, I know, decided this year she was cutting all of her queen cells back to 1 per box. And I have cut mine back to 2 per box. But I have had 3 swarms of my own this year. And they have been from nucleus colonies with 2 queen cells, which normally that would never happen. So it's just a really crazy year.
Yeah, and when I do my splits, I cut them down to 1 cell because I don't want to give them options. And I usually end up somehow making my splits too strong where they think they can pull that off anyway. So, but cutting it down doesn't mean I'm going to, you can move those cells into other nukes. You can keep chopping as much as you want. You don't have to cut them all out if you have room.
Yeah.
Kathy's got her hand raised again.
Oh, well, my sound is terrible, so I'm missing. Ken, I was listening to how you store your boxes. Now, this is like after you've extracted honey, you're storing the boxes with the tool, the wedding veil material in between each box.
Right, but the queen excluder on the bottom so the air can flow through.
Okay.
And go ahead. Oh,
I was going to say I have I use all mediums, so I'm interchanging, so I don't have what I call clean frames. The frames that have only had honey in them, you're not going to see wax moth in those. They really, they're called a wax moth, but they should be called a pollen moth.
Yeah, that's true. They like
because they lay the eggs in the pollen, and to store during the winter, I take the boxes with the frames that have had pollen and brood in them, and I turn them on the side, stack them up. I don't stack them, flat. I turn them on the side, and I only leave about 5 frames in, so there's a lot of air exchange going on. And if I was going to store it outside, I'd put a tarp over it. I store mine in my garage, and I never get wax moth in the boxes, and I don't have to tape them or put anything in between them or anything like that, because basically because of the airflow and it being cold.
Airflow in chilly temperatures is really your best friend.
Yeah, exactly.
It looks like Tylee has their hand raised.
Hi, yeah, my question goes along with that and what Ken was saying. So when you store honey supers, do you need to store them in the open air, or can you just like put them in a container? Because I've just never, this is my first year, so I have no idea. And now I'm thinking I might actually end up taking a frame or 2 out, so I want to know what to do.
Yeah, wax moths don't like light, so storing them somewhere where the light gets to them is helpful. If we didn't live in such a wet, icky winter climate, then lots of beekeepers in other parts of the country leave theirs outside under a shed roof. And certainly somewhere that freezes is an awesome place to keep them, because if you do get wax moth larvae in there, it'll freeze. Keeping them in a tub won't help if they already have eggs in it. So if you freeze it and then put it in the tub, then you'd be better off than if you didn't freeze it.
Another question in chat here from Anna. First year beekeeper, question about bearding. Bees are outside the hive every evening when it cools down, not a ton, but 4 inches high. They look regimented, all facing upward. Daytime, they are very, very active. I see pollen and lots of activity. Is this normal behavior, or should she take some sort of action?
Right, so we covered bearding. I can go ahead and show that slide again. Bearding is a way to manage the temperature. And so the bees have been bearding a lot this year. Here it is. So in order to help mitigate that, use an upper entrance to increase the airflow, add space to give them somewhere else to go besides staying outside. Using a screen bottom board helps with the airflow, and then the slatted rack on the bottom here is a place for them to hang out. So like if Kit had a slatted rack in hers, they would probably hang out there instead of outside. But if there's no swarm cells and you've got plenty of space in your brood box and your supers and they're still bearding, it's no big deal.
And adding an upper entrance could be as simple as just a few twigs underneath the lid to lift it up a little bit, or a shim or something like that.
Just
Something
aware of that after the yellow jackets come out, because then you leave the whole face open.
Right. Benjamin asks, speaking of queen cells, should I remove them when I find them, or does it depend on whether they are on the bottom of the frame or the top half?
It does matter. So the ones that are on the bottom of the frame, those are swarm cells, and that's caused by not enough room in either where, in the honey super or in the brood box. So it could be one or it could be both. If there are queen cells in the middle of the frame, those are supersedure cells, and the bees have decided there's something wrong with your queen. And so they've decided to get rid of her, and I leave those. I do, and now if there's 3 or 4, I cut it back to 1 or 2.
Kathy's got her hand raised.
Oh, I just wanted to say an old timer when I was beekeeping in California told me to use pennies on the 4 corners of your box for ventilation, and it's narrow enough that yellow jackets and other bees can't get in or out.
That's
And
a good idea.
Yeah, I like that. Or I tried to find little twigs or something really small like that that's not much thicker than a penny. Something that you can't really use.
Like pennies.
Jessica asks, is it better to treat a hive for mites ASAP or wait for the blackberry flow to end?
So it depends on what your mite count is. So I don't recommend that you treat unless the mite counts are higher than 2%. Remember, treatments are like antibiotics a little bit, in that the more we use treatments, the more likely the mites are to develop resistance. So use them sparingly is my humble advice. And so I have started doing mite counts. I use an alcohol wash, and I check monthly. And I only treat if the mite count is above 2%.
Megley has her hand raised.
Hey, since we're talking about counting mites, I keep balancing between, do I do a sugar shake or do I do an alcohol wash? And there's pros and cons to each, it looks like. What are your guys' experience? And as experienced beekeepers, what do you recommend?
Well, a sugar shake is not as effective at dislodging all the mites. The best thing to use, and this is off of Randy Oliver's scientific beekeeping site, is to use 70% alcohol if you can get it. If you can't get isopropyl alcohol or rubbing alcohol right now, you could use Everclear or vodka. Both of them will work. And if you think about it,
he's also got. Oh, I didn't raise my hand.
It's only 3%. It's only 300 bees, and there's tens of thousands of bees in there right now. So it's not that big of a sacrifice for the colony for the greater good.
And Kathy?
On the BL list, they are talking about Dawn liquid in place of alcohol, and it works very effectively mixed with a little bit of water.
Hey, did you say liquid soap?
Yes.
You mix.
Sorry.
Liquid. So
Wouldn't it get all foamy though?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. How do you get the foam out of
that? Good question.
I mean, I guess you could wait, but then that's like, by the time you walk away and come back to that, it's gonna.
Well, the foam is usually on the top, and the mites are on the bottom. So I think maybe it's not a big problem. I'd have to go back and see if I could find somebody that asked that as a question. But I thought it was.
Benjamin's got it right. He says most folks
not
already
with people
have
not having access to alcohol. Of course they do.
Yeah, I like the powdered sugar because you're not killing anyone, but you really do have to do it for 3 to 4 minutes, and you're gonna need a second. You're gonna need to shake out the powdered sugar once and do another tablespoon of it. So because otherwise it starts getting clumpy and it's not gonna be effective anymore. I think that's usually where your numbers get off, is because people just are trying to use as little as possible. But you need that dry powdered sugar in there to get those mites dislodged.
And the Easy Check mite wash device is super simple. It's $20. Everybody has it.
Can you use wiper fluid in that?
You can. I've tried using it, but I don't think it's very effective. I did my own deal, and I didn't. It only got about half as many mites off as the other. And I even used the winter kind.
If you get a high mite count during the honey flow and you plan to harvest, are there certain treatments that are okay?
Yeah, so if you have your supers on right now, your option is hop guard, but that has to be used when there's no capped brood. Really, the best option with your super on is Mite Away Quick Strips or Formic Pro. Be really careful though if you're going to use that over the next couple weeks, because the temperatures are going to be really hot, and don't use it if the outside temperatures are outside of the range listed in the package. You'll end up with lots of dead bees and maybe lose your queen.
DP says experiment for yourself, do a sugar shake count, then follow with an alcohol wash to see how many more mites you got off.
Yep, you can do that too.
Okay, I think we've got
That's the
all.
end of the chat. Does anybody have any other questions?
Mangley raised her hand again.
I actually, you're probably gonna laugh at this question because, but would you recommend harvesting a little bit of honey the first year, since you were talking about harvesting as you go, to make sure that they still have enough honey at the end of the year, or not?
It's up to you. Jeff wasn't kidding about the third honey flow in the fall. So for all of the people who don't treat their colonies for mites, so I harvest blackberry honey, and then right before the knotweed starts blooming, I harvest honey. And then when the knotweed's done blooming, I harvest again. And then some of my colonies are still pretty light, but I've had colonies gain 70 pounds in 2 weeks when there's no honey flow on in September. And that's when all my neighbors' bees are dying and my bees are going and robbing them out. So long as you have really healthy bees, if you want to harvest a frame or two of honey the first year, there's nothing the matter with that. If it's in the super especially, go for it. Just make sure it's capped. Because if you harvest it before it's capped and it's too wet, you'll end up with fermented honey, and that'll be no good unless you like mead. Go ahead and do it. And then if worst case scenario, start feeding your colony 2-to-1 sugar syrup in the fall, in September, and get them up to weight.
And Kathy, did you have a comment on that? Kathy?
Kathy?
She raised her hand.
You can test your nectar to see if it's honey, if it's not capped, by shaking it. And if anything comes out, it's not right. But if nothing comes out and you don't see it capped, you can extract it. And then it saves a lot of work.
Say that again.
So you can take the frame. So if this is a frame, I got my weird screen on. So this is a frame. If you hold it over the top of your beehive on the frames and give it a shake, if a bunch of nectar falls out, it's wet.
Oh.
If when you shake it and no nectar falls out, it's ready to be capped anyway, and you can extract it. But you don't want to leave it stored for a long time because honey absorbs water from the air. So that capping is what keeps the honey from doing that. So if it's uncapped, make sure you extract it right away or within a month or so.
Brian says, when does the knotweed flow start?
It usually starts in late August, early September.
That's another go out and look at the plants, I guess.
Yeah.
Knotweed grows around waterways, usually.
It loves water. Yeah, water. It's designated a noxious weeds, and it is. It's all of that and more. It's growing in my neighbor's lot behind me, and I love it because my honey knotweed honey is awesome, but it's a pain in the neck to keep out of my yard, and it's in really wet, boggy areas. And it grows like bamboo, except it dies off every year. So it grows 8, 9, 10 feet tall, and then it'll die completely off in the winter, and then it'll grow all the way back.
Benjamin asks, how much honey should be left 2 deep brood boxes to make sure that there's enough to overwinter?
So you for sure want to leave at least 70 pounds of honey. So one deep frame is about 10 pounds, and one medium frame is about 4 pounds. So you kind of have to guesstimate, unless you have a hive scale, and add up the honey arches that you have in some, and then you'll have full frames in others. But so as in after say August, the bees will start filling the top in with honey and forcing the queen down into the bottom. So they should start filling in that whole top brood chamber and forcing the queen to lay in the bottom box.
Right, and so a deep box is going to be 90 pounds of honey if it's completely capped. So if you have half capped arches for a whole box and then partials another one, that you can use that as part of your estimate too. It goes with Christian's next question is how much honey would one full medium frame have in it?
About 4 pounds. It's about 4 pounds if it's drawn out right to the edge of the frame.
Tracy, I heard you say earlier that you tend to harvest throughout the year. If it's a first year hive, do you do that, or do you wait until the end of the year, like October, and harvest then?
You can do that. Most people only harvest once, but I sell honey. I sell blackberry honey, and then I sell knotweed honey too. So I don't want it to mix. So that's why as soon as the blackberries are done, I pull all the supers that I have that have capped honey or honey that's ripe, and I extract. And that way I can run less boxes too.
So do you take the first year hive different from a second year hive?
No.
That's okay.
No, I mean, it depends. It depends on the colony itself. So like that colony that I have, that was that first swarm that I got, it's huge. And I've got 3 supers on it. I've got others that have less, but that, if you manage each colony, then if they have extra honey, then go ahead and extract it. Or if you have multiple colonies and you need it for one of the other colonies that's light, save it and feed it to them.
Sure. I guess I've always taken the approach that if it's a first year hive, you always should let them build their stores to get them to the winter. And then if they have enough in October, then go ahead and pull it off. It sounds like it's different from what you're saying. You're saying if they have enough honey, take it off even if it's June or July.
Well, because I run, like that swarm that I have is 2 deeps plus 3 supers right now, and it's a first year colony. Okay. So they only need 70 pounds for the winter, and they've got probably in excess of 60 pounds already in the supers alone, plus honey that's down below. So I don't worry about it so much. Plus, like I said, in the fall, I get so much honey from my neighbors' beehives dying that.
Well, and Tracy's also giving you an answer from someone who owns their own extractor. If you're your own backyard beekeeper with one hive, wait to do that one time and rent an extractor for that, and maybe even get together with your neighbors, because it's a lot of work to haul that home, run it, clean it out, and then haul it back.
I have 4 hives, and 2 are from last year and 2 are from this year, one including one is a swarm. So I'm making sure they have enough before I'm pulling off any honey. But this is the first year that I did have one swarm that had a full super full of 10 frames full of honey early. So I pulled that off.
Nice.
I figured it's going to be early enough to let them build their honey stores for the winter for the next few months. Yeah, it's be okay. I did feel like I was cheating them out of their honey just a little bit.
Don't feel bad.
Okay. I won't feel bad unless they don't make it through the winter.
Yeah, then don't blame me. Honestly, making it through the winter isn't as much about starvation as it is about what your mite count is in August when the bees are making winter bees. Because if they're not healthy winter bees, they're not going to make it, and they're going to die by October. And if they make it the winter, they're probably going to make it at least till March. And that's when Rusty Burlew talks about the Ides of March. That's when starvation happens because they either can't get to the stores or they've eaten through all they have, and then they don't make it.
I've had a number of years that they made it to like April, maybe, and then like you pull the top off and there's bees in there, but then a month and a half later and stuff, there's no bees.
Right, because they starve.
Yeah, I figured that I started somewhere and they started treating for mites in the fall, and that made a big difference in how they make the winter.
Oh, for sure. I think it's important that if you have a high mite count, though, in August, that you treat in August. A lot of people wait until the fall to, September or October to test for mites, and it's too late then because the damage is done. All those winter bees are infected with viruses, and they're lower weight than a normal winter bee. Their fat bodies aren't as robust, and so they just don't make it. So it's super important to know what your mite counts are the 1st of August and do something about it if it's high.
I'm curious because one of the apiaries I work with in Snohomish for a while said basically, I mean, if they're your first year hive or an established hive, doesn't matter. They all have mites in them. So treat. I mean, what's your approach on that? Should you treat no matter what, or should you always count first?
I'm a microbiologist.
Okay.
I recommend counting first because I don't think that it's good to use mite treatments over and over and over because that's what causes resistance. And so if you only treat when you need it, then you're going to have therapies ready and useful when you actually do. And that's why I use drone comb too, because I don't like to have to treat. And that's why I also use Varroa hygienic queens, because those bees can smell the mites and they'll uncap the cells and they'll remove the infected ones. And so the mite counts stay lower for the whole year with that type of queen. Plus with the drone combs, I usually end up like Tina did with 2 or 3 mites per alcohol wash. And if I have any colonies that are over that, I requeen them. I don't put up with that.
Christian has a couple questions in chat. Which treatment do you use in August, and do you treat again in the fall?
So it depends. If you have your super on in August, your choice is Formic Pro or Mite Away Quick Strips. It's the same thing, just a little bit different packaging. By the way, don't use Mite Away Quick Strips that are old. They only have a shelf life of 1 year. And the trouble with treating in August with Mite Away Quick Strips is it's hot. So you've got to, what people will do is they'll put an extra super on to give them more space, just empty space on top, and then look at the calendar at the forecast and try to treat during the coolest days. And then pretty much the only time I treat is in the fall, and I use Apogard in the fall after I take my supers off. So as soon as the knotweed stops blooming, then I pull my supers and I treat with Apogard. You can't use that with your supers on. It makes everything smell like Listerine.
Ken has his hand raised.
Yeah, a comment I want to make is that an old-time beekeeper told me a few years back that more bees starve in April than starve during the winter. And I was not sure the impact of that until we had about 2 weeks of rain and they couldn't leave the hive, and I went out to the hives and I had 3 inches of dead bees in front of several hives. And so that's one thing to remember when it's raining in the spring. In the spring for many days, they might need some feed.
Well, and when Kathy and I were taking our master beekeeping classes, we had the luxury of having an animal nutritionist teach part of the class. And he pointed out the importance of starting to feed your bees pollen patties in February. And there's several peer-reviewed articles that show that your colony is about twice as big by the time you reach May than if you had not fed them. So lots of people think about syrup, but they totally forget about the pollen piece.
Yeah.
Tracy, I've never used pollen patties. I've always seen the hives. They've been flourishing, and I thought, well, if they're doing well, that's sufficient. How do you measure if you need pollen patties or not, or you should just always use them?
So well, at the beginning of the year, there's no pollen in there. So if you start feeding pollen in February, before the tassels come on the cattails and stuff, then you'll give them a boost. So if your colony doesn't have a row of cells in it that look like Jeff's screen, then they need pollen.
Yeah, your bees behind you there look like they're starving on that new comb.
Yeah, they totally are starving. I don't use wired frames, but that looks really cool, so I stole it.
Usually I see like that brand new beautiful comb, and then there's a few grains of pollen that bees have already started to cram in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Can you safely, Lisa asked if you can safely open a hive in February to add pollen or if it's too cold.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the answer is yes. So it's already cold, and in February they don't have any brood probably that they're going to build or to keep warm. What you don't want to do is move any of the frames around. So I have a feeder shim on the top, so my box and then the feeder shim, and I just crack the box open, slide usually all the bees are on top of the frames anyway, just crack that up, slide a pollen patty in, close it, and you're done.
Randy Oliver had a great photo in one of his presentations of them feeding in snow one year, and he's like, if they're starving, they need food. You got to feed them. They can deal with the cold.
Rusty talks about that on the Honeybee Suite too. She's like, what do you have to lose? They're for sure going to die if you don't feed them, and they might live if you do.
Yeah. It looks like that's so. Jennifer, did you want to ask your top bar question?
Yeah, yes, please. Yeah, I was really looking forward to your class this year, and I was sorry that it got canceled. So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I had questions about so it's a new hive, and I just wanted to know how much should I be concerned? How many frames of honey will they need to winter over? So they haven't built out to the back of the box yet, but they've got quite a bit. They've probably got 5 or 6, maybe more. I don't know if that's a lot.
5 or 6 combs built?
Yeah, of honey. They've got a lot. They've probably got a dozen in the box already.
Yeah, so a comb is, you can weigh them, but they're around 6 or 7 pounds each. So
okay.
if you've got 7, yeah, how many do you have? You said 5 or 6?
At present, yes.
So yeah, I mean, you've already got probably 30 pounds. So if you have nice honey arches on all those frames, add a couple pounds for each of those frames, and you should be probably in a good range.
Okie dokie. Should I be moving them down so they have more room for brood comb, or do I just like look at them to make sure they have enough brood going? Because they have the brood in the front, because you're top bar. I was just wondering because I'm hearing the honey bound thing, and I was just wondering.
So in top bars, if I get worried about that, at some point they're going to be pushing the queen back with honey. So it is going to condense that brood area. It's probably. Are you feeding right now?
No, they're not really. I was feeding, and they just weren't interested, and I was more concerned about the sugar water molding. I have a lot of things blooming, and there's a whole bunch of blackberry at 80th and I-5, and I have the fireweed, and I have a lot. There's a lot blooming in the neighborhood.
Yeah. So, are they still drawing comb?
I'm sorry?
Are they still drawing comb in the back?
They look like they are. They're active. They're doing all kinds of stuff.
So if it seems like they're putting too much nectar into the brood area, so if like when you look at those frames, you have honey arch, pollen, and then you should have brood. But if
Right.
all the little spots where the brood's hatching out is full of like, shininess, which is the nectar, then the queen's running out of places to lay there. And so if all the frames look like that and there's no room, as soon as it hatches, they fill that with nectar. You need to encourage them you need to create some space for the queen. So what I usually do is go to that very back comb, which they've started to draw out, but they probably haven't filled it with anything, and I'll move that forward into the brood nest area. And that will really, they don't like that. So they'll really encourage them to finish that. And that pulls resources out of it pulls all that nectar out of those frames. So the queen now has someplace to lay. So they need it to make that comb. So I'll do that. I'll just, every inspection, if it seems like the problem is still there, I'll just keep pulling that last one forward that started. And at some point, they'll stop making them in the back because they're putting all their resources into drawing those out.
Oh, okay.
But
All
you
right.
shouldn't need to do that too much longer. I mean, it's a lot of the flows of I feel like here in Queen Anne, a lot of it's started to wrap up. So I was seeing a lot of nectar right up until the end of the linden. So linden trees are starting to bloom now, but right up into the end of the locust trees. And then the blackberry started, and I haven't seen much blackberry nectar come in at all.
Okay.
So they did have a lot of nectar, and now they're acting really dry. And I don't know if it's been the on and off rain we've had the last few weeks, but here in Seattle, it hasn't been very good.
So I should let them have all the honey for the winter, and next year maybe they'll fill out the whole box, and then maybe it's possible to get honey. I mean, I'm fine with that. I just was curious about the top bar.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got multiple, you might harvest one of them. I mean,
okay. All right. They're okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
Did we ever find Kit?
Kit just, she says, thank you everyone for participating. I'm sorry I haven't been able to say hi with my microphone being stubborn. So she's been here in spirit, but she hasn't been able to talk to us. We can get the whiteboard out and she can move letters over, I guess. All right. I guess if there's no other questions, we can wrap up.
Okay, everybody. Good luck with your bees this month.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good program, folks.
Bye, all.
Bye.
Bye. See you later.